Hello everyone and welcome to Writers Book Club podcast. I'm Michelle Barraclough and each month I take a deep dive with an author into the writing craft and process behind one of their books. Today on the podcast, I'm delighted to bring you another highly experienced novelist, the talented Ber Carroll, or BM Carroll as you might know her. Ber has just published her 12th novel, One of Us is Missing, and it's a masterclass in domestic suspense. I couldn't put it down. Because she pivoted from commercial fiction with her first 7 novels to domestic suspense with her last 5, Ber had to learn the rules of crime writing, so she talks about what those techniques are. And with this novel, she had to completely change the structure to make the pacing work, so she talks about that in detail too, which is fascinating. Ber also talks about when she introduces a spreadsheet to her process because old accountant habits die hard, apparently. And we also talked about the importance for her of beta readers, which is something I don't think I've asked anyone before on the podcast. So it was really great to get her insights into that. I think you'll find it really useful. Okay, let me tell you what One of Us is Missing is all about. Rachel and Rory Sullivan decide to celebrate making it through a difficult year by taking their teenagers, Emmett and Bridie, to their first stadium concert. By the end of the night, one of the 4 has vanished without a trace. As the police investigation intensifies, suspicion is cast on the remaining family members. Everyone has been deceiving one another, but who is to blame for what went wrong? The passing of each hour amplifies their terror that life will never be the same again. One of Us is Missing is a dark domestic thriller about the dangers lurking right in plain sight. Ber Carroll is the author of 12 novels, with her last 5 novels published under the name BM Carroll. Her novel You Had It Coming was shortlisted for the 2022 Ned Kelly Award for Best Crime Fiction and the 2022 Davitt Award for Best Adult Novel. And it wouldn't surprise me if this latest novel, One of Us is Missing, is put up for a few prizes as well. It's really, really good. Now, before we dive in to the interview, I must also tell you that Ber very generously agreed to a few spoilers. Not all of them, just a few. We do actually tell you who goes missing. So if you haven't yet read One of Us is Missing, consider this your warning. Okay, enjoy this chat with the fabulous Ber Carroll. Ber, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Michelle, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited to have you because you are such an experienced and accomplished novelist. And I always think that our listeners get the most from authors who have quite a few novels and experience under their belt. I'd like to start with the premise for One of Us is Missing and where those ideas originally came from.
The premise is a family of 4 who go to a large stadium concert, and it actually is a fictional Coldplay concert. And while they're at this concert, one of the 4 goes missing. And at the end of the night, the remaining family members wait at their meeting spot outside the stadium. But as the hours pass and the police become involved, we begin to learn things about the family, and we learn that they were struggling in the months leading up to the concert and that they have secrets they've kept from each other, that they've been deceiving one another. But we also learn that they've more enemies than what they ever realized they had, and there are people out there who want to hurt them.
Coincidentally, the night of the Taylor Swift concert was the Friday night. It was a roasting hot day, like sweaty. We're getting out in our sequins and things, just going, this is just ridiculously hot. And then a huge storm came in and it started raining. And I was reading your book thinking, that was the Taylor Swift concert. I mean, I know it wasn't, but it was just, that could have been. And I was there with my daughter, who's 13, and we were meeting some other daughters of a friend who I'd offered to bring back home to the Northern Beaches. And we had a meeting spot for these young girls. And I just thought, oh, there, but for the grace of God.
Yes. Look,
You had a similar experience, didn't you?
I did. Actually, I've been to 2 concerts like that where it's been an absolutely roasting hot day, and then there's been a massive storm. And actually, the previous time Taylor Swift was here, that happened. There was this huge storm, and the concert was delayed for a while, for at least an hour. And then she came out, and it was still raining, but she looked amazing, even though she was drowned wet. And also with that U2 concert, there was a storm as well. So it sort of adds to the drama. I don't know whether, I guess, is in Sydney between November and February, that's what you get. You get, intensely hot days that often end with a storm. But for the mood of this book, it fits as well, right?
Yeah.
It adds to the moodiness before the storm, and people are sweating, and suddenly the clouds are gathering and gathering and gathering. And so, and yes, it's similar to you at Taylor Swift. I got this idea when I was at a U2 concert with my children, and I couldn't get 4 tickets together when I was booking the tickets. And I remember these tickets went on sale at 3 o'clock, and by 3:03, they were gone. Right. And I was online, and all that was left were platinum tickets that were something like $400 each. And I was like, and my kids were really keen to go, because I guess children, absorb your taste in music just as we absorb their taste in music. There's so many people of our age who are Taylor Swift fans because of our children,
Yep.
and vice versa. They like bands like U2 and Coldplay, and because of us. And so they were really keen to go to this concert. And there was a couple of general admission, and my son was over my shoulder saying, book it, book it, book it, book it. We'll be okay on the field. We'll be okay in the field. And I booked it because it was either that or nothing. And then on the night of the concert, I was up in my stand seat, and I was looking down at this throbbing, heaving mess of people down on the field. And all I could think about was my 14-year-old, who did not know the city at all, did not know her way around the city at all, and my overconfident 17-year-old. And I thought, oh my God, they're going to get separated. They're going to get separated, and she is not going to know where she is or what to do. And, and that's all I could think about for the whole concert. And now, 5 years later, I have a book entirely based on that fear.
You had to play out the worst possible scenario in fiction.
Well, it's a great premise until you sit down and
Great premise.
hey, crap, what's happened to one of these people? Premises are great until you actually have to back it up with 100,000 words. And then you're like, oh no.
It's such a great premise. But then you have to, as you say, write the 100,000 words. So how did you know, or at what point did you know that was going to be a whole novel?
I am one of those people who I will sit there until it is a whole novel. I've never given up on a novel yet.
Yeah.
I've sort of never allowed myself to have writer's block, because I feel if you sit there for long enough, something will happen. Something will actually happen if you sit there for long enough. So it's a long road to make it into a novel. And I think with this one, I started with the people. I started with the 4 people, and I tried to imagine where they were at. And even that for me is now a challenge, because I'm on my 12th book. Trying to come up with new people and new characters is not easy. And, somebody who's distinctly different from the other 12 novels, and all of whom have a lot of key characters. I'm often accused of having far too many characters. So it's a challenge. And so it took me a while to get to know who the people were. And then I guess once I got to know who they were, the stuff started happening, and it's all very organic for me. I don't plan it. So I just feel my way into the story.
Yeah. So you knew you had these 4 characters, and what happened then? Like, how did that process roll out for you?
Well, look, chapter 1 was initially entirely different, because this novel was turned back to front. But I'll talk about the original.
Yes.
The original draft. The original draft started 4 months before the concert. And I knew, I guess, that Rachel was building up to doing something that was quite unforgivable in her marriage. I kind of had that in the back of my head. Other than that, I had no idea. I had no idea where all the others were at. So it took a lot of feeling around to get those early chapters up and running. And then I guess I gradually worked my way up to the point of the concert. And I tried to set it up so that it could be any one of the 4, that they all had a reason to disappear, that they all had a reason, they all had enough going on in their lives for there to be concerned for their welfare. And so I tried to set that up. And then once I had that set up, I got to the night of the concert. And then, because, the spoilers in this, I can say that it is Bridie, the young teenage girl who goes missing, which some people might say is predictable. But to me, I suppose, I didn't feel it was predictable because I genuinely didn't know. But I guess when you step back, you could call it predictable that it was a teenage girl. She's probably the most vulnerable of the group in terms of being able to fend for herself. And then I had this terrible problem of, okay, she's gone. We've had her point of view up to now, and now it's gone. What do I do? And I had all these problems then that were very complicated about, okay, we've stopped hearing from Bridie, and we've got her parents racing against time. And I solved some of the problems by situating her brother outside the stadium, and so that he wasn't moving. And I was quite interested in this idea that you're in a stadium like Allianz or Homebush. And if something like that happens, at what point do you go home? At what point do you leave this place where you've lost somebody and say, they're not here, I will go home? So I was kind of interested, I guess, in that scenario. So I solved some of the problems by leaving Emmett there. And then at a certain point, Bridie is reintroduced. And as I was working through all those plot points, I was like, oh my God, I'll be quite honest with you, Michelle. I had a lot of trouble coming up with what was going to happen to Bridie because I didn't want it to get too bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to go down the road of, I don't want to go too dark. And
Yeah.
I was like thinking, oh my God, how do I get her out of this? How can I possibly get her out of this? And that plagued me for quite some time. And eventually I got her out of it. And that was my first draft.
I love that she has agency in that too. I thought that was a brilliant bit of writing there. When we start to hear from Bridie again, she's a great character.
There was a point there where I know with the editors we were talking about, isn't Rachel meant to be the hero or Rory? And I was like, well, no, she's here. She's going to have to get herself out of this. Yes, they're helping in every way they can, but she's going to have to get herself out of it. And I did enjoy that, especially the way she gets herself out of it, because it made sense, it tied things in the novel. I was very pleased when I thought, oh, she can do this, and certainly makes Rory's profession relevant to the plot. So I was really pleased when, that idea came into my head.
Now that I'm thinking about it, those little twists, I want to say, or just those moments where, it ties back into Rory's profession and she thinks, oh, this is something I've learned from my dad. And then I don't know, we're doing too many spoilers, but it was just a lovely serendipitous moment. And for you as a writer, as you were thinking about these things, because I know you don't plan, but it must have just be such a satisfying moment when you think, oh, that's how she can do it.
Yeah, and I think that's the huge benefit of rewriting and redrafting is you come up with totally new things. You start with that scaffolding and suddenly you go, oh my goodness, this is how I can do it. And there is nothing more satisfying than that feeling that you've suddenly made some of that kind of build up even more relevant. You've knitted it together, I guess.
Yeah.
And it is hugely satisfying. And I sometimes feel, I don't know if you could ever plan for that. Well, I certainly can't plan for that. That comes from somewhere in my subconscious. And if I sat down and tried to plan for that, I wouldn't be able to come up with anything.
Yeah. And it might not even be as good if you did try to plan it. Even just you saying before about keeping Emmett at the stadium, I mean, there was a reason that you wanted to do that initially, but from a plot perspective, keeping him at the stadium, it gave the opportunity for him to get one of the really critical clues from somebody that worked at the stadium. It gave him, there was an opportunity for a bit of a red herring there with the homeless guy. There were all these other things. It gave him the opportunity when Rory says, his dad says, well, I'll stay tonight with you on one of the nights. It gave them this
Yeah.
really touching moment between the father and the son to sort of sort out some of their stuff that was going on. So, keeping Emmett at the stadium had these beautiful flow on effects, both from character development, plot development.
Yeah, and one thing I have realized, there's lots of things I didn't know about writing crime because I'm learning it as I go, and there's
Mm.
lots of rules, which I'll talk about in a second.
Yes, please.
And there's rules about crime writing that are occasionally pointed out to me when I break them. It is very difficult to maintain, four people kind of doing things in a situation of high stress.
Mm.
So it's very helpful to have them in different places to be able to distinguish what each of them are doing instead of having them all in the same place and thinking the same thing. When you're in tense moments in a crime novel, it's very helpful to be able to switch to another point of view and go to a different place and both diffuse the tension and build the tension at the same time and add layers and add another layer of complexity. That's very hard to do if everyone's in the same place.
And just talking about those four perspectives there, you've got the mum, the dad, and the two kids. And when I counted up the chapters, that's 84
Yeah.
chapters.
Yes.
But the beauty, I mean, having that many characters, you do need to keep that pace going because we want to get back to some of the characters, don't we? So we don't want those chapters to be too long. Is that one of the rules of writing crime with multiple perspectives as well, that you just don't want to leave it too long between perspectives?
I think so because they're not descriptive chapters. They're not as, oh, I'm here and look at the scenery and look at the flowers, and they're tense chapters. They're moving quickly. And really when you're done, you're done. You're done with the scene.
Mm.
And anytime I even try to go on a bit too long, somebody will come along and delete it anyway. One of the editors will come along and just press delete. So, I mean, I do try to spend more time on description than what you probably see in the book, but very often it gets deleted, which is probably good because I'm not very good at description anyway. I'm not very
And
good.
yet I could perfectly picture all of the settings. So you did a great job, I think, with fewer words, obviously, if some of them got cut. But these editors know what they're doing, don't they? Like I could picture all those settings that you had, the houses, the stadium, where Bridie ends up. There was enough there.
Good, good. So, yeah, I think short chapters and always ending the chapter on something that is interesting or a question or a semi cliffhanger or something that's going to make somebody keep going to the next short chapter. Like last night, I was reading a Jack Jordan book, and it's the first time I've read a Jack Jordan book, and I can see he's doing the exact same thing. He's finishing every chapter on a note where I have to read the next short chapter, and it was midnight and I was still going reading on. So it's those kind of techniques I think are well-known techniques in crime.
What are some of the other techniques or crime techniques that you had to learn?
Well, so when this novel was written in its first iteration, as I explained, it started 4 months before the concert, and it was a slower build-up to who was going missing. I was able to introduce all the characters more slowly. I think in this version, everybody gets introduced really fast, and I'm sure everyone kind of goes, "Oh my God, that's a lot of names in a short period of time." But because we jumped right into the concert, I couldn't lie about who was who. I couldn't lie about the things that were on their mind. I had to say who was on their mind. And so I couldn't go through with this gradual introduction. But the reason for changing it around was my publisher said to me, well, this is a very nice family drama that eventually gets very dark. But, it's not a seat of your pants kind of book. And I don't want a family drama from you, basically. He's extremely blunt. And, so I went, and then he suggested turning it back to front and starting with the concert and flashing back, which sounds like, and I went, okay, that sounds, relatively easy to do. But as soon as I started to do it, I realized this is actually probably one of the biggest rewrites I've ever done in my life, even though the characters are the same, the premise was the same. There was no changes around the characters or who they were, their motivations, no cutting of characters, no, but changing that structure made everything profoundly different. And I soon realized, gosh, if I'm going to keep track of, because when I write that first version, I'm keeping track in my head. And because I'm following the story along, I'm quite surprised by what happens. So I know where the reader's at because that's where I'm at. But as soon as I start moving things around, at that point, it's easier to lose track of what's what, much, much easier once that first version is done. And usually at that point, I introduce a spreadsheet. That's when I go back and I say,
Yes.
okay, well, this is what's happened. This is when it's happened. And now I'm moving things around. What does the reader know now? And so I started off with a new blank document, and I do copy and paste into the document, but only when I was satisfied that it followed the trajectory of the new structure. And I had to do a lot of padding I think during that rewrite, I added 15,000 words to try and coordinate the back and forth nature of the narrative, and to help with the early sections and the difficulty of joining these characters in the middle of the drama and all the other secondary characters around them. So it was very difficult technically, even though the story essentially didn't change that much except for one thing.
I can only imagine how that spreadsheet looked.
Yeah, it's a very basic spreadsheet. It's a basic spreadsheet with 85 chapters. Is that a record? Is that a record number of chapters?
It's a record on this podcast.
Oh God. I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing.
It is a good thing in this case, because those 4 characters, it's so pacey. It's brilliant. Yeah. And you don't notice, oh my God, I've got 84 chapters to get through. You're just like, okay, now what's Bridie up to? Now what's Emmett up to now? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's really well done.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I don't intend to break all these rules, right? But then when I remember with the missing pieces of Sophie McCarthy, when I wrote the first version of that, I had 9 different perspectives in the first person. And everyone was going, what? And I was like, but that's how I wanted to write it. And when that was edited, it got down to 7 different perspectives in the first person, which I know now is quite unusual, but that was how the story wanted to be told. And I do remember doing something at the New South Wales Writers Centre, trying to explain myself. But, it's fun sometimes to break the rules. And I have noticed that when I have lots of perspectives, you need to keep things moving. And especially in this genre, you need to keep things moving. And you can't be going back over the same ground or the same location, or, everyone has to add something new.
Yeah, that's a good point about having multiple points of view and making sure that their locations are different. Oh,
yeah, it helps the reader orientate themselves better.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that before. I think that's a bit of a trick of the trade, isn't it?
Yeah, it's become clear to me, even I'm working on a draft of a new novel, and the novel is about a teacher who gets a death threat. And clearly a lot of the characters are based in this school, but I'm thinking to myself, oh, that's a big problem, because it's hard to distinguish them, and the reader uses location to distinguish people. It's much easier to become familiar with new characters when they're away from the first character, or if they're somewhere different in a different environment. So I kept thinking of how to get the characters out of the school. So, it's sort of something I realized along the way. And going back, I think I implied there was one other thing that happened during this restructure. And again, it was a rule that I had broken. And so this is a huge spoiler.
Okay, spoiler alert. Fast forward if you don't want to hear it.
Okay, so the only other thing that changed in this story was, in the original version, there was an Uber driver who had taken Bridie. And my publisher said, you cannot have somebody commit the crime who the reader doesn't know. But the Uber driver had been there. It had been the Uber driver who had dropped Bridie to school one day. So he knew where she lived.
Right.
Where she went to school. He knew her name. So there's lots of things Uber drivers know about you. And I was like, but, in real life, crimes are committed by people who you don't know,
Mhm.
but who know you. And he was like, no, it's one of the rules of crime, Ber. You can't have the Uber driver be the person responsible. So I did change the perpetrator, but it wasn't as a profound a change as what you might think because this character was already very much embedded in the story.
But that was genius. I'm glad they made you change it to
Yes.
the new
Yeah.
perpetrator
Yeah.
because there's emotional stakes in that
There
that
is.
there wouldn't be with an Uber driver.
And that's, I think, the point. There was, I guess, it was a very valid point,
Mm.
is that the reader is not reading to find out about a stranger.
Mm.
That might be the situation in real life, but in these type of novels, the reader has an expectation that they know the perpetrator and that they've had enough clues and that they are very much aware of who this person is.
Mm.
And that's fair enough, right? When he said that, I thought,
Absolutely.
okay, that's fair enough. And then I actually had a lot of fun going back to change the
See
emphasis
it.
on this person who was
Mm.
already there. So I did come up with that person myself. I was really happy, and I
Oh,
thought, here's a candidate. How can I get him to this place now?
yeah. Desperation.
Yes,
Yeah. When you think about it.
inspiration. Yeah.
Yeah, you must have had a lot of fun with that.
I did. And it took a few iterations. So
Mm.
after I did the full restructure, and one thing I would say is when you've done a huge restructure like that, you can't, I knew I was 90% there, but I guess I'm experienced enough now to know that you will create new issues along the way. There will be gaps there because of what you changed and the shorter time frame you've changed it in, that there's going to be things there that you won't have thought of, that had you been writing it in that order to start with, you would have thought of. So I know that when I reshuffle a book to that extent, that I am going to create some issues. And so I did, when I got to that stage, I did give it to some writer friends. I think I gave it to 4 people to read, and I listened hard to what they had to say, and I filled those gaps that I had created in terms of motivation and reasoning. And I was like probably 80% there in terms of motivation, but I needed a little bit more. And so that was really helpful having that feedback at that stage. So by the time I gave it back to my publisher, I was pretty confident this is working.
I don't think I've ever asked an author this question before about having beta readers.
Yeah.
So you have your trusted network of people who read your work. Do you make sure that there's a bit of a quorum around those ideas? Or if people have all said the same thing, it's like, yep, that's something that needs to be fixed? Or is it a little bit more intuitive? Like if one of your readers picks up on motivation, but the others haven't picked that up, do you think, well, I really trust that person on motivation. And I think that they really know what they're talking about there. So I really do need to take that on board and make that change.
It's a bit of everything. Some of it is they've all said the same thing. I'm in trouble here, even though I might not agree. If you've got 3 people saying the same thing, then you have a problem. And sometimes it might be only one person saying it, but as soon as they say it, you go, yeah, you're right. Immediately you'll know that they're right. But sometimes, and this is less often, but it does happen too, it's because you've asked them to nitpick. They're nitpicking, and sometimes it is nitpicking, and it's actually, I feel confident saying that's a minor issue, and actually that's okay. That's okay. And I'm okay to not take that on board. So it can be all of those. It's a bit like with editors, you know, I kind of find with this genre, I'm probably have disagreed with editors more than what I ever did before writing this genre.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they have sometimes a very different view. Sometimes they want you to go crazy and turn everyone into psychopaths. And I'm like, no, I
That's
don't.
not real life, though, is it?
No, and I think it's very important to me that the characters are real. And I think
Mm.
I feel like that's my niche, that I hope that's my niche, that the characters are real and that people could think I know this family, I know who these people are, they're real to me, and therefore I care about them, right? There is a genre of crime fiction where, the characters are highly unlikable. And I find it hard to care then. They're fun to read, and because you're trying to find out what happened, but they're not tense
Yeah.
because you're lacking in the care factor. And so sometimes editors do want you to go too dark. That wasn't the case with this novel, but there was a big debate in this novel about the revelation of who is behind this, right? And again, I'm just going by instinct when I do these things, but to me, you can't leave that until the last minute because there was a lot to be resolved after that person was revealed. There was a whole court case where other things were revealed. And so there was a bit of back and forth, whereas, they were saying, you've revealed this. And we were down to this level at the 87% through the novel, you've revealed who. And I said, yeah, that's the perfect time to reveal who did it. And I said all that in a very kind of confident tone of voice, as if, again, I know what I'm doing, but I actually don't really know what I'm doing. It's all instinct. And so there was a bit of back and forth. And I asserted myself there and I said, no, this feels like the right time for me to find out who did this so that there is an appropriate amount of the novel left to explain fully why they did it.
Yeah, I was hanging to find out the motivation and all the ins and outs. And I loved that you put that court case in because it helped to tie all those other perpetrators that were involved in and what happened on the actual night and the person that, I don't know how many spoilers to do, but I loved all of that closure. I don't like it when we just get the name of the perpetrator and then, just a tiny little bit of the aftermath. Like I loved all that detail. That was brilliant.
Yeah. Well, it felt to me this was as you say, a crime of desperation.
Yeah.
And therefore that desperation needed to be properly conveyed and also what it had done to the characters afterwards. And when I say what it had done, I mean particularly to Rory, who has changed profoundly because of what happened.
That's the dad character.
Yes. And I guess instead of the perpetrator being revealed at the last page, I sort of revealed what he had done to secure his family, his family's future. And I thought, well, I'm not giving you this, but I'll give you this instead. And actually what Rory did, there was also quite a bit of debate amongst my beta readers about whether that was acceptable or not acceptable. Actually, they were 50-50 on that.
Okay, right. So you just had to go with your gut on that.
My gut, yeah, I went with my gut on that. But again, because of their feedback, I spent more time explaining his rationale. So their feedback was hugely beneficial in that I didn't, ignore it. I thought, well, I still want him to do this, but I'm going to invest more time explaining his rationale. And I think very often that's what you're getting from the beta readers. You often think when you've addressed something, but you haven't addressed something in enough depth to justify it. And very often that's what they're telling you. Give me more depth so that I believe this.
Was there any other big changes either from them or from your editor that you could share with us?
So changing the structure did kind of help me solve that point of view issue with Bridie because there was so much back and forth. Bridie's absence was less noticeable.
Yes, because we're still getting bits of her in the past stories.
So it actually solved that whole problem of,
where's Bridie? Yeah,
where's
we need
Bridie?
her voice.
And then you see, because initially Bridie was gone and then she was reintroduced and it's a bit disconcerting. Oh, she's back.
Which would have also worked.
Yeah. I mean, as my publisher said, oh, this is a really good family drama, Ber.
Yeah.
And then he went, yeah, but you've gone really dark. But, if you're going to go there, you might as well go the whole hog, And so the structure change did facilitate that. So in many ways, though, the story itself from its first iteration, there wasn't a single character taken out, which is quite unusual in editing. All of their background, was the same.
Well, are those secondary characters Emmett's friends, Rory's errant brother from Ireland, they all were suspects. So they had to be there.
Yes. And I've sort of come to the conclusion, and as I said, I do get accused of this a lot of having too many characters. But I'm like going, look, in your normal family, I wish I could bring them to see my family with the six of us and there's so many extras and cousins. And I'm like going, this is a normal family, guys, you know? If you want to portray real life, you need people, you know? I mean, there is that appeal of the low-key kind of crime where there's only a few people there and, you know, you don't need to know all the extras. But in real life, in this genre, there are lots of extras. And if you start making it very simple, people are thinking, where are their friends?
Yeah.
Where are their parents? You know, it's a constant question. And if they're on their own, people automatically assume, well, that person isn't kind of real because they've got no friends, they've got no family, they've got no work colleagues. And in reality, everybody has those three things: work colleagues, friends, family. And unfortunately, when you're writing, I just find it so difficult to minimize the characters. And this is not even my worst book when it comes to characters. It actually isn't.
I was just thinking back to Hannah Ritchell's last book, The Search Party. So she has 8 points of view. So you are not
Yes.
on your own there.
Yeah. Yeah. She does have 8 points of view, and they all feel very real and necessary.
And let's not handhold our reader too much. We're all pretty switched on. We can handle 4 characters. We can handle 6 secondary characters. We've got this,
Yeah.
don't spoon feed us. I mean, look, I have a tendency when I'm writing to say, oh, I don't really want to write that person's husband, so I'll just make him dead.
Ah,
Not ideal either. Like, I probably need to do the hard work and go, well, who is he and what's his story and tralala, and bring him in,
you.
because that's going to add the depth and the reality and the layers.
Yeah, it's complicated though. It's complicated when you have different perspectives. And I guess in this scenario, it was all the one family, which helped. Having said that, writing teens is very hard. That wasn't easy, but then of course teens have their networks and they're not going to feel real unless you include their networks. And again, I felt quite happy in the end because their networks of friends were very relevant to the plot.
Yeah.
So I guess once you can make all of those extra things relevant to the plot, then it becomes it's in the novel for a reason. So not only is it making the setting more realistic and the characters more realistic, you have connected it to the plot, and that's gives it a reason to be.
Mm-mm. Speaking of the characters and their different perspectives, how did you get into the voice and differentiate them on the page?
I love dialogue. It's my comfort zone. Whereas describing things, I always, when I think of describing things, I always kind of think I need to put Vanessa McCausland on my payroll because she loves describing things. And apparently she used to be a travel writer. So she would go into a room and kind of go, oh, well, there's this and there's that and there's this texture and that. And whereas I'm like, I can't be bothered, blah, blah, blah. Give me somebody talking, whereas other people hate the dialogue and they're trying to avoid the dialogue.
I mean, it probably helps with Vanessa that she's setting them in these beautiful, French countryside and what have you, not just like outside a stadium in Sydney.
Yeah, but even when I'm pretty sure Vanessa could do a very good
She
job in the
could.
stadium in Sydney.
She really would. She
She
would.
could do a really good job. I guess differentiating these voices, I did have trouble with the teenagers, obviously. And lucky for me, I've got 2 on tap. I love books, love writing, and are very invested in the process because they were there when I got the idea for this book. We're all going to a Coldplay concert together at the end of the year. So they're very invested, have been invested in the process. And so I did show both of them early chapters and say, okay, these are the chapters from the teenagers, and help me where I've got it wrong, where I sound like a mom instead of a teenager. And usually it wasn't a lot, but it's often small things that make a big difference, and They helped me with some of the dialogue, particularly at school. Now, some of their suggestions were far too colourful to make it into the novel because how people speak, particularly boys, speak to each other is not
Yeah.
publishable.
Yeah.
But they were certainly really helpful in trying to, fix the tone of those chapters. And I do remember having a long discussion with the two of them about junkies, druggos, and druggies, and who would use what terminology. And even the two of them disagreed. There was almost a difference in terminology between my son, who's now 22, and my daughter, who's 19. There's like a semi-generational difference between how they describe certain things. And very often it's just that word that they use is different to the word we use.
I'd love to actually just to demonstrate that. Should we just read a little bit from one of the sections?
Sure.
Maybe when Emmett's in the park.
Okay, here goes.
Okay.
Emmett. One positive thing he could say about the boys was that they never overanalyzed or delved too deeply into things. Danny punched him on the arm. Sullivan, where the fuck have you been? Alex shoved a beer in his face. $5, mate. Mate's rates. Looking sharp, Sullivan, Fitz drawled. Mike might hook up with some MILFs tonight. Actually, MILFs was, I originally had cougars and they were like, no.
That's our term.
Yes.
Ourselves.
Yes. And mates rates is a big thing with them, right? Mates rates.
Right.
Yeah, that's a big thing. Fitz had scored last-minute tickets through his uncle, who couldn't attend for some reason. Danny had declared his disinterest, and the extra ticket had been sold uncontested to Alex. Now Danny was hiding his regret with scathing remarks. Yeah, get ready to be the youngest there. Coldplayer totally passed it. Coldplayer classic, Alex insisted. You're missing out, bro. Emmett took a long glug of beer and allowed the bickering and chatter to wash over him. He'd missed his friends these last few months. He'd missed the banter, the company, the security they offered. But he'd changed too much to just slot back in. Yeah, he was here, talking to them and all, but he didn't quite fit. And he hadn't entirely forgiven them either, if he were honest. That's a sick tattoo, Fitz said, his eyes focusing in on Emmett's arm. Danny, tactile as ever, pulled up the sleeve of Emmett's t-shirt for a closer examination. Sick, he agreed. The tattoo, a Celtic braid-like pattern encircling his upper arm, was only a week old. Emmett took an even longer glug of beer, feigning nonchalance. The alcohol and pure approval oozed into his bloodstream, diluting the self-hatred and unlocking his voice. Yeah, Courtney did it for me. She's a complete bitch, but really good at her job, you know? She scowled the whole time she was doing it. Half expected her to stab the needle in my eye.
That's great. Also, the dialogue's great, and I think it just gives us such an insight. Like, to me, that rang very true. I've got like you, a 21-year-old, and sometimes I do eavesdrop on him with his mates when they're around, and they punch each other and they rib each other. But what I love too is that you've got a bit of Emmett's interiority going on there too. It's not just all dialogue and action. So we're getting a bit of who he is. And I think when you do that with all of the characters, that's what helps us to get to know them. And even though, they've all done things that aren't, well, particularly Rachel, we still like her because we're getting her thought processes and we understand a little bit of what's happened in her life. And so balancing out, I know you say you love dialogue, but balancing that out with that interior monologue as well and that interiority, I really liked the way you did that, Ber. I think a lot of writers could really learn from that, even if they're writing something like this where there's got to be a lot of pace, is to have that balance of dialogue and interiority.
Thank you. I'm not even aware sometimes that I'm doing it. I'm probably trying to get out of describing the park where they're sitting at.
What do you think is the secret to good dialogue, Ber? Do you walk around the house talking out the parts?
Yeah, well, I do. Or if I'm sitting there typing it, I'll say it and then I'll fix it. But then I just sort of keep fixing it. And I'll keep fixing it. And sometimes if it's a very difficult exchange, it can take you can still be fixing it until the very last minute. When it's going to print, I'll still be like, oh God, I'm still not happy with that exchange. And, I'm still not happy with how that has.
When you say you're not happy, is that just tonally it just sounds off? It doesn't sound realistic, or you're
Yeah, all of those things. Tonally, how realistic does it sound? Is there enough back and forth?
Mm.
Because really, even the way we're talking right now, it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And you need to give a taste of that, I think, to the reader without having pages on it. So it takes work.
Do you ever feel like when you're writing dialogue that you sometimes get bogged down with dialogue tags or accompanying actions, and then you have to strip that back?
Well, I think, yes, and very often editors strip it back as well.
Right.
They do not like too many tags at all. They don't. And it's kind of one of those things, I guess, about writing. The good writers do it very deftly, and the rest of us run around in circles trying to get it right. There's dialogue tags, there's movement around the room, how to kind of portray that without going into details. There's not even secondary characters, but characters in the background who are kind of making fleeting appearances, how to describe them without describing them.
Yeah.
Right? How to just create an image with a few words and move on. Because at the end of the day, the reader needs to be able to see what's happening, but this person isn't particularly important. So all of those kind of things are invisible when you're reading it, but are the things that slow you up when you're writing it. Very often it's not the plot or the characters that's slowing me up. It's those little technicalities, how to both insert them and make them invisible.
Yeah. This is your 12th novel and your 5th in this genre. Did this novel teach you anything new about writing?
It taught me new things about crime.
Right.
It taught me that you need to start with impact. And I thought I had started with impact. In fairness, I thought I had, because I had the original chapter, Rachel was booking the tickets. So we saw how the split tickets happened. And I finished the chapter with saying that, if only she had known, what that would do. I thought I'd kind of finished the chapter with a real sense of foreboding, but it wasn't impactful enough. So you do have to start with a bang. And now I realize, of course, if you know from the blurb that one of these characters is going to go missing, how long are you going to wait to make people find out who it is? It probably is irritating waiting. So I kind of realize now that actually starting right at the concert was a good thing to do. So I guess starting with impact is one of the things I have learned. As we discuss, I've learned that the perpetrator has to be somebody that is known. And, I always knew that the clues had to be there. There were clues there in the original version, but the fact that it wasn't a character that was, intimately known by the reader was an issue. I think I've learned as a writer where I'm prepared to go to and where I'm not prepared to go to. So when I was trying to figure out what has happened to Bridie, it needed to be realistic what had happened to Bridie, but none of those realistic outcomes were particularly savory to me. And I was like, oh my God, I don't want to write about this and I don't want to write about that. There are some areas as a crime writer that I do not want to write about. And so I was doing everything I could to get her out of the situation without that eventuality happening. So I felt very invested in her rescue.
Yeah, but there's enough of a sense of foreboding to see where it could have gone and where
Yes.
it probably was going.
Yes.
We're talking about digital images of
Yes.
girls. My husband read this before I did, and I just said, what? Because he kept going, oh, guys, it's horrifying. It's horrifying. So I was expecting quite graphic content. And
Yeah.
so when I read it, I thought, well, there's the hint of it, there's the foreboding of it. And that's what he was reacting to, as the father
Yes.
of a daughter, two daughters actually. But, so I think you nailed that without going there and being
Yes.
very graphic with what potentially could happen to a young girl. That could have happened was just as tense and awful, I think.
Yeah. Well, that was a revelation to me, I guess.
Mm.
What am I prepared to do, and where am I prepared to go? And I think that was one of the big things. Great premise, Ber, but big problem.
There's enough of those books around, though, if people want that. I think it's domestic suspense. And it's the suspense that's just as gripping and just as compelling as a reader than seeing all the graphic, gory details of a
Yes.
crime.
Yeah. And in terms of other learnings, I guess the one thing I would say is, all my novels are very different, and they've all involved a different writing process. And I've sort of come to the point now where I've accepted that. I've stopped expecting them to be the same. And they're all completely different, and they've all caused me gray hairs in different ways. But it is the one thing I would say, I suppose, with this novel, I have an even greater appreciation for that writer's circle. And I think every writer needs that writer's circle. They need somebody, and more than one person, because as you said, there are very often varying viewpoints to help them, particularly not only in the early stages, but in the later stages when they've made changes that they are nervous about that may or may not work. They need that security blanket before submitting it, because as good as publishers are and as good as editors are, they're not prepared to have five, different versions of the novel. And even if they did have five different versions of the novel, they too would be compromised because they've read it before, and they're not going to pick up, the holes in the same way as a fresh reader would late in the day. So I think I'm not only grateful for all of that input, but I see how necessary it is to have all that input and to have time up your sleeve to be able to make those changes with
Yeah.
confidence, and not to be making them in a rush, because if you make them in a rush, then there will be problems.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure that you return the favor and have your own speciality that your friends or writer friends
I
rely
hope
on as
so.
well.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I love reading novels, and I love giving feedback that I then don't have to act on. It's fantastic. It's the best feeling ever.
Isn't it amazing, though, that you can see things in other people? Because you're not as close to it. I know that.
Yeah.
It's so much easier to give advice than it is to see it in your own work.
I feel it's impossible to write the perfect novel on your own.
Mm.
I will, especially if it's a crime novel. Like, I think if it's a literary novel, maybe, because it's more on the line, and you can work to make each line perfect for as long as you want to, and in isolation, as long
Mm.
as you want to. Like, nobody's ever going to come back to you as a writer and say, can you make this line more beautiful? Right? They're going to say, oh, yeah, that's clunky, or delete this, make it a bit more streamlined. But they're not going to say, can you make it more beautiful? That's really down to the writer themselves and how much time they're devoting to the writing process and how good they are at that aspect of writing. But when it comes to crime novels, it's all about tricking your reader, and it's all about reader experience. And so you have to think about reader experience in a completely different way than what I ever thought about reader experience when I was writing commercial fiction. I'm constantly thinking now, what is the reader thinking now? Where are they at now? I'm a lot more connected to the reader. I mean, with my first draft, I am that reader because I'm revealing the story to myself. But then as soon as I change that first draft, I'm constantly conscious about the reader in a way that I was never before. And so you're so immersed in the story, there are things that you cannot see. You cannot see until somebody steps out of it. And very often you've seen them to a certain extent, or you've addressed them to a certain extent. They might say a certain, feedback, and you kind of go, but I did this and I did this. And they were like, well, yeah, but that wasn't enough to convince me. That wasn't enough to justify these actions or to justify this move. And And so I think you more than ever need that feedback, more than ever, um, to give the story the layers that the story needs.
I'm going to let you go soon because but I could just talk to you all day. I would love to know, having gone through this experience where you really had to restructure the whole thing quite radically, are
Yeah.
you tempted, or I know you're probably writing your next book, but were you tempted to say, right, that's not going to happen again. This time I'm going to start with a plan. Do you ever think this time I'll do it differently? And then it just goes where it wants to go.
I find, and I've accepted this with other books, I've tried to start with a plan. And
Yeah.
like I have, I guess with some of my books, the one before this, and it's always a case of as soon as you say that was an easy book to write, then the next one. And this was an easy book to write until we changed it. You know, some books are always harder than other books. And the one before this was a very easy book to write that I sat down and wrote and survived, you know, in terms of structure. We did combine chapters, which was tricky, and things like that. But we concealed one thing, which only involved deleting 4 lines. But it was a much easier book to write. So the problem that I have is when I sit down and plan, I can't think of anything. I can't think of a single thing that would happen in the book. I have to be typing to get ideas. Typing or about to fall asleep or walking the dog, but certainly not planning.
Yeah.
And planning to me just dries up all thought. I can't come up with a single idea. For some people, it's the planning, it's the post-it notes, it's the placing them in places that stimulates ideas. For me, it's the feeling of my fingers on the keys that stimulates ideas.
And it's a different kind of a brain, isn't it? Because like you said, then you introduced the spreadsheet to get the structure and to
Yes.
make sure that it did what it was supposed
Yeah.
to do.
I'm still a left-brained person, Michelle. I was an
Yeah.
accountant. I was an accountant, like, so I am still a left, and I guess plot-wise, I'm always trying to tie up the loose ends and tie things in. And, you know, I probably get far too excited about, tying things up. So, but when it comes to ideas, that's not how they generate for me. They don't generate from spreadsheets or planning, or they come from a subconscious place. And so I've come to accept the fact that if I sit down and try and plan the next novel, I will have zero ideas on what will happen.
So you're currently writing, though? You've got another one?
Yeah, so I am currently writing, but nobody has read it. And I know it has lots of issues that I need to attempt to resolve before I even give it to those early readers. But, I'm experienced enough to know now, yeah, it's got this issue, this issue. And with this book in the first draft, I knew exactly what the issues were. Some of them I was able to work out myself. Some of them I needed feedback to work out on, work them out. And I think every book has its issues, and sometimes they go to print with those issues. Sometimes they do. And some editors are very good at characterization and things like that. And some editors are very good at crime. Others are lacking experience in crime. So it's kind of like, every editor brings something different to the table. I mentioned earlier in this genre, I find myself disagreeing more with editors than what I would have with my earlier novels, because there's more to disagree about. They're a lot more complicated. These books are a lot more complicated than what they look. Like, they're so fast to read, but they're way more complicated than writing a commercial fiction book.
Is this your genre now, Ber? Do you ever get ideas for something, that could be a good commercial fiction novel? Or...
Sometimes I do, but I'm really happy in this genre. I think even those ideas, I can kind of twist them a little bit and make them fit this genre better.
She's going dark now, people. I take your family drama and I will twist that.
Yeah, it's fun. It is fun in a kind of terrifying manner.
Thank you so much for your time today. That has been the best chat. I could keep going, but
Thank
I know
you.
you've probably got some writing to do.
Yeah, well, I wish I could say I had some writing to do, but I have to go and do the grocery shop because, life as a writer is so glamorous. So glamorous.
Well, I wish for you some good ideas in the grocery store.
Yeah,
that's what we can hope for. Just walking around and just going, oh, now how can I kill this person off?
That's exactly when it happens, though, when you're doing those kind of tasks, is when, you see things or hear things, and there's inspiration everywhere, all around you, especially at the local shopping mall.
Well, get to the grocery shopping, get some good ideas, and thank you again so much. It's been delightful.
Thanks, Michelle.
There you go, Ber Carroll. Isn't she wonderful? That was such a great chat. I loved it. And hey, if you enjoyed listening to Ber and you'd like to see her talking about her novel in person, she has events. So if you're listening to this in the first week of June 2024, you still have time to get to one of Ber's events. You can catch her at Lane Cove Library in conversation with Vanessa McCausland, who is apparently going on Ber's payroll. And Ber's official book launch is at Harry Hartog at Warringah Mall in Brookvale here in Sydney on June 14 at 6 p.m, where Ali Lowe will be in the hot seat asking the questions. And for all you inner city folk, Ber will be chatting with Anna Downs at Better Read Than Dead at 6:30 p.m. on June 17. You can find all the details for these events and Ber's other 11 novels on her website at bercarroll.com. And don't forget to go and follow her on Facebook and Instagram. Links for all of this are in the show notes right here in your podcast app. Okay, which book are we reading next? I've got a fella for you this month. A highly accomplished writer of fiction and non-fiction and a journalist with 35 years at the ABC under his belt. I'm talking about Michael Brissenden. We're going to be doing a deep dive into his latest novel, a crime thriller called Smoke. Let me tell you what it's about. After a brutal wildfire tears through the town of Jasper in the Californian Sierras, a body is discovered in a shed. It looks like an open and shut case of accidental death until further investigation reveals that the victim was locked in from the outside. Years after leaving Jasper, Detective Alex Markov has been sent back under the shadow of an LAPD corruption investigation. She's convinced that the man, a family friend, was murdered opportunistically under the cover of the fire. As the smoke clears, Alex reveals a town corrupt to its core, but exposing that corruption could destroy her and the people she loves. Will she ignore the crookedness and deceit, or face the consequences of pursuing an inconvenient truth? So we're pivoting from domestic suspense with Ber's novel to a more traditional crime thriller novel, and I think this will be a good one for those of you who are writing in that genre. Also, if you're thinking of setting a book overseas, shoot me your questions for Michael on what's involved with that. Smoke is out now, so grab a copy, have a read, and send in your writing questions for Michael. You can send me your questions in any way, shape or form, as a DM or on Instagram or Facebook. There's a form on the website at writersbookclubpodcast.com that you can fill in as well. Everyone who asks a question gets a shout out on the podcast and a link to you in the show notes. So get those questions over to me by about the 20th of June so I can ask Michael your question in the interview. And of course, I'm giving away a copy of Michael's novel Smoke with thanks to Affirm Press. All the details for the giveaway are over on Instagram and Facebook. Okay, lovely people, that is it for this month. As always, I'm recording on the beautiful unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I'm lucky enough to live and work. I'll catch you next month. Until then, happy writing.